Okay, it looks like we are live streaming now. Let me just make sure the video and the audio is good on that. And
Greg, I should probably just mention that my internet connection is not super strong. So it's possible that my internet will futz out at a certain point. If that happens, I can use my phone.
okay.
And sometimes my iPad works better on Zoom. So if I fuzz out, I'll rejoin the meeting very quickly.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for the heads up. So we'll be on the lookout for that. Okay. So today I think this is our 10th session on Hegel and Dialetheism. So some people I think haven't given up on us yet, and they're still tuning in every week. So congratulations to those of you who haven't given up on us yet. So yeah, today we're happy to have Nick Stang give a talk. The title, I believe, is Contradiction, Determination, and Negation in Hegel's Logic. So the floor is yours. Look forward to your talk. Thanks.
Okay, great. So can I share my screen?
Yes, go for it.
Yes, excellent. Okay. So as you will see from the first page of the handout, the title has changed because it's now only about one of those things. Because I discovered that giving a talk, even figuring out just contradiction in Hegel is probably more than I can do in a single talk. So the topic of this talk is really just Hegel on contradiction. So this, in a certain way, is the talk that the paper that I wound up writing in the course of trying to write that more ambitious paper. Okay, so here's a quote from The Science of Logic that we're all very familiar with. It is an excessive tenderness for the world to keep contradiction away from it, to transfer it to spirit instead, to reason, and to leave it there unresolved. Now, this passage is often cited in discussions of Hegel, contradiction, and dialetheism, and presumably in the talks previous in this series, several of you have even cited it. But by itself, it doesn't settle several really critical questions. One, what is a contradiction according to Hegel? Two, what exactly is the status of the principle of contradiction in Hegel's logic, which I will abbreviate as PC? And what role, if any, does the principle of contradiction play in what Hegel calls the movement of the logic? The aim of this talk is to give preliminary answers to these questions, and I'll end up saying much more about 1 and 2 than 3. And now, even now looking at these, I realize how partial and preliminary my answers, even to 1 and 2, really are. Now, the larger aim of this bit of research, to which this talk is really just a kind of prolegomenon, is to determine whether the principle of contradiction is presupposed in the logic, or some version of the principle of contradiction is presupposed in the logic, and to what extent this undermines the presuppositionless character of the logic. Because on a certain way of reading the logic works by seeking to resolve contradictions, which is a kind of principle of contradiction, a kind of regulative version of the principle of contradiction. And one question that people have about that kind of reading of the logic is whether that means that Hegel has to presuppose that regulative version of the principle of contradiction. That's what I ultimately want to figure out. But as I said, I'm not going to figure that out today. I'm going to lay the groundwork for hopefully figuring that out in the future. So, terminological note, capital L logic refers to the Hegelian science. Little l logic refers to what we now mean by logic, but I'm not taking a stand on the relation between those two. I think they are very closely connected, but I just want to have a special word for Hegel's project. And that science is carried out in 2 different books, The Science of Logic and the first part of the encyclopedia. So the first question, what is a contradiction, is relatively straightforward to state, but it's very far from straightforward to answer. And in fact, it's going to probably be most of what I spend this talk trying to figure out. But let me just begin by saying a little bit more about what question 2 means, which I hope will in turn shed some light on question 3. So here are 2 statuses the principle of contradiction could have for Hegel. And now I see I edited this handout at the last minute, didn't change this to 3. There's only 3 statuses the principle of contradiction could have for Hegel. But one of them is obviously misguided, so we can just kind of dispense with it. 1, contradictions are unthinkable. No putatively contradictory thought is a thought at all. Second, contradictions are thoughts, but they are defective in some way. And finally, there are contradictory thoughts, but they're not defective in any respect. Well, the first one can't represent Hegel's view, because every thought determination, at least those prior to the concept, is involved in some contradiction. And this would entail that we are not thinking at those stages in the logic. But logic isn't merely a science that takes thinking as an object. It is also, like all sciences, an exercise of thinking. And so if some later stage in the logic wasn't mediated by thinking, then it wouldn't be derivable within logic. There would have to be some non-thinking, non-logical precursor to that earlier stage, and the logic would begin in a certain sense wherever the thinking begins, wherever the non-contradictory thinking begins. And so I think we can just dispense with that way of thinking about the principle of contradiction in Hegel. But neither can the third view be Hegel's answer, because in the very passages where he criticizes the role of the principle of contradiction in previous philosophy, he also always insists that the point is to resolve contradictions. So he goes on in that very same passage from the Science of Logic to say, spirit is the one which is strong enough that it can endure contradiction, but it is spirit again which knows how to resolve it. And then he goes on in the Encyclopedia Logic to say, even more straightforwardly, what is right in this claim that contradictions cannot be thought? That would be the first way of reading the principle of contradiction, is that the matter is not at an end with a contradiction, that the contradiction sublates itself through itself. So that suggests that something in the middle between the unthinkability of contradictions and contradictory thoughts just being completely non-defective has to be the right view. But what is the defective character of contradictory thoughts? Why must thought try to resolve them? And what is the status of this requirement that thought overcome or resolve contradictions? That's what I mean by the status of the principle of contradiction. What is the nature of this requirement or this need that thought has to resolve contradictions? A natural answer would be that contradictory thought is thought that is not true in Hegel's highly idiosyncratic sense, thought that is not in agreement with itself or in agreement with its concept. But that doesn't answer the question, where does Hegel show that that thought's concept requires it to be non-contradictory? Or where does he show that the self-agreement of thought with itself lies in its avoiding contradictions? Now, to answer this question, what I'm going to do in this talk is examine in detail the contradiction section in the Doctrine of Essence. Spoiler alert, it's going to have a somewhat negative or deflationary conclusion, namely that the contradiction section doesn't actually really answer these questions. In a certain sense, if you really want to know the status of this requirement to resolve or avoid contradictions, it is precisely the contradiction section that can't tell you. And I'll try to say something about why that is. Okay, so as always, when we're talking about anything in Hegel, we have to situate what we're talking about in the systematic order of the book that it's in. Right? Everything in the proper interpretation of Hegel depends on getting things in the right order. So if we look here at this table, what we see is the discussion of contradiction is located in a different systematic order in the Science of Logic than it is in the Encyclopedia. And this, I just like to note that the 1817 and 1830 encyclopedias agree up to this. There are some differences that largely consist in Zusätze that are in the 1830 encyclopedia, but not in the 1817 one. But this order of categories is the same between both of them. But as you'll notice, in the Science of Logic, so if we sort of equate these two, if we just think of these two as being the same, in the Science of Logic, we can also equate these two. So we have the book, the second part of the logic is essence. Within that, there's a first section, essence as reflection itself, or essence as the ground of existence, as it's called in encyclopedia. But the difference is that in the Science of Logic, there's an initial chapter on shine, which is missing in the encyclopedia. Then in the science of logic, the more important difference for our purposes is that the second chapter divides into 3 parts: A, B, C, identity, difference, contradiction. But the corresponding section in the encyclopedia, the pure determinations of reflection, divides alpha, beta, gamma into identity, difference, and ground. Whereas in the science of logic, ground is the 3rd chapter. So in the science of logic, we have shine, essentialities of determination, ground. In the doctrine of in the encyclopedia logic, we have pure determinations of reflection, identity, difference, ground, and then existence. So there's a disjointness between the order of the categories here. Or another way of putting that is contradiction maps to ground in the encyclopedia logic. Now, is any of this of any philosophical significance? Is this anything more than a kind of idiosyncrasy of the table of contents, more so to speak, of these 2 different Hegelian works? Well, the only way to answer that is to look in detail at what Hegel says about contradiction in both the encyclopedia logic and the science of logic, and to see whether they really shed light on what contradiction in the logic as a whole is. So what I'm going to do today is focus on the science of logic with occasional reference to the encyclopedia logic. And time permitting, I'm going to return to this issue of the difference of the order of the categories in the science of logic and the encyclopedia logic. And let me just say, if you think that these triadic structures in Hegel are very important, it's very noticeable that identity, difference, contradiction is replaced with identity, difference, ground, especially if you think the 3rd of any triad is the resolution of the contradictory relationship between the previous 2. The science of logic seems to be saying the name of the contradictory relation between identity, difference is contradiction, while the encyclopedia logic seems to be saying that it is ground. Okay, now, why is it important, or what is the significance of the fact that the discussion of contradiction occurs in the doctrine of essence rather than in the doctrine of being? Fully answering that would require nothing less than a kind of complete account of what the doctrine of essence is, or Hegel's notion of essence. I'm not going to do that today. I'll just say something of a kind of preliminary fashion about how I understand the difference between being and essence in the science of logic. So I take it that once we move to the doctrine of essence in the science of logic, we're now thinking a difference within being between what being is and how it is. And that's Hegel's name, or Hegel's name for that is the difference between essence and shine, Wesen and Schein. And I'm going to follow Di Giovanni in translating shine as shine. What his great homophonic translation of shine. I think it's actually kind of, I like that translation. So now what does that mean? That means that all of the determinations of being that we've uncovered in the logic or the doctrine of being are, from the point of view of essence, the immediate determinations of being. That's how being is. But now we think, what is the essence of being that determines or is the source of those immediate determinations of being? And because those original determinations of being are now thought of as the immediate or shining determinations of being, the essence of being, at least at the beginning of the doctrine of essence, is still completely indeterminate. The only notion we have of the essence of being is it just is, it's what being is, or it's not what being is immediately, but the essence of being. And so then we need to further determine what the essence of being is. Now, one other thing that I want to note about that, I think that I keep saying the essence of being. Is that the essence of being or the essence of beings? I think it's both, because it's the essence of being as the most general category. But then of any being, we have to think of it through the category of being. And then once we get to the doctrine of essence, we also have to think the being of that being through the category of essence. So we're talking about the essence of being in general, but in talking about the essence of being in general, we're also talking about the essence of every being. But we have to keep things at the properly logical level, and no individual being is a topic of logic. So I'm going to, as much as possible, try to formulate this as the essence of being in general. So we have all of the determinations of being that we've uncovered in the doctrine of being, and now we want to know what the essence of all of that is. Any being that we could think about, we would have to think about using the determinations of being. And now in the doctrine of essence, we would have to think about the essence of that being. But the more general, the more properly logical level is just to talk about the essence of being itself, not the essence of any particular being. Okay, now I'm going to skip the first section of, sorry, the first chapter of the first section of the doctrine of essence, Shine, because I think it's the hardest part of the doctrine of essence, which Hegel himself says is the hardest part of the logic. So I don't have anything informative to say about Shine, and it may be a weakness of my reading of the essentialities or determinations of reflection that I don't have a good account of what Shine is. So I'm just going to confess at the outset that I don't really have a good account of Shine. Or sorry, I don't have a good account of that section, chapter, the chapter about Shine. So I'm just going to skip immediately to identity, as Hegel does in the Encyclopedia Logic. So he says, in the very beginning of this chapter, the essentialities or determinations of reflection. Here, let me just add that this is in the science of logic. Essence is simple self-reference, pure identity. This is its determination, one by which it is rather the absence of determination. Now, I think that looking for historical references or historical parallels is of limited use in understanding the logic, but it's of limited use, not zero use. In that, I think sometimes it's helpful just to sort of fix what topic Hegel wants to have in mind, but then to understand the development of the logic, you have to understand it on its own terms. So just to fix topics here, I think the two key historical references that Hegel has in mind here would be the first principle of Fichte's 1794 Grundlage der gesamten Wissenschaftslehre, where the first principle is the self-identity of I am I, and the opening of Schelling's 1801 Darstellung, which begins with the self-identity of reason, which is in 1801 Schelling's term for the absolute. So we start with some notion of just pure, completely indeterminate self-identity. So now the category of identity here is not numerical identity, understood as the relation that every being has to itself and no other. Why? Because that notion isn't by itself an essence logical notion. You can, for instance, have a notion of numerical identity without even having the notion of essence on board. And that shows you that numerical identity by itself can't be the essence logical notion of identity. So instead, the notion of identity, or the category of identity, is, I take it, the category of essence, the essence of being, understood as pure indeterminate self-identity, rather than the essence of individual beings. Okay? So, as I said before, in talking about the essence of being, we're also derivatively talking about the essence of individual beings, but fundamentally, we're just talking about the essence of being as such. So the reason I think it's completely indeterminate self-identity of being as such is because the pure self-identity of an individual being isn't completely indeterminate. That a being is self-identical, that its essence is what it is, or that its essence is the same in all of its shine, is indeterminate with respect to any further determinations of that being. It doesn't tell you anything specifically about that being. But because it is the self-identity of an individual being, a determinate specific being, it's not the completely pure, totally indeterminate self-identity that Hegel is talking about. For instance, it's not the completely indeterminate starting point of Schelling's 1801 Darstellung. So I think we need to think an even more indeterminate self-identity than the self-identity of the essence of an individual being. Okay, so then I just want to just emphasize that although we're talking about the essence of being rather than the essence of individual being, we can derivatively use these categories to talk about the essence of individual beings. Now, what does it mean that being is the same in all shine, or the essence of being is the same in all shine? Or the essence, or derivatively, the essence of a being is identical through all shine. It's not appropriate to introduce time or space into the logic, but if we were to do that, the thought would be the essence of a being is the same across all time and in all space. But we can sort of analogously think of logical space and think that the essence of a being is the same across all thoughts about it. And likewise, the essence of being is self-identical across all thoughts about being. Whenever we think about being, the essence of being is the same in all thinkable thoughts. Now, one of the most famous features, one of the features of the discussion of identity, difference, and contradiction in the science of logic and in encyclopedic logic, one of the features that's attracted the most attention from commentators is that for each of the determinations of reflection, identity, difference, and then within difference, diversity, likeness, unlikeness, positive and negative, and then contradiction, Hegel identifies a corresponding principle of the common logic. For instance, corresponding to the category of identity is the principle of identity. For all A is A. And Hegel thinks that these principles of the common logic that are derivative of these categories distort the properly logical meaning of the corresponding category in two interconnected ways. For one, they consider them merely the formal or abstract meaning of the relevant category. And secondly, they supply as the substrate or the subject of the principle everything, understood as generalizing or quantifying over every being. So the idea is we treat the category as a predicate, self-identity or identity, and then we need something to predicate that. And these derivative logical principles, because these are categories of thinking, they have to apply to every being. So we just predicate identity of everything, which I interpret as a kind of implicit quantifier. For every being, that being is identical to itself. But these derivative common logical principles distort the properly logical meaning of the categories, precisely in virtue of the fact that they concern merely the formal meaning of the relevant category, and they take them to be principles about every being. Their formality means that they enforce a distinction between a schematic form, like A is A, and the matter or content that can realize this schema, particular values of A. In doing so, they distort the meaning of the category because logic isn't formal logic. Hegel's logic is not the provision of a set of schemata, which can be instantiated with respect to a set of objects or predicates. So the categories of logic aren't the categories of formal logic. The categories of logic are not the categories of certain kinds of expressions certain kinds of argument types, or certain kinds of entities that can be filled in as values of variables in schemata. In particular, identity isn't the relation of numerical identity that holds between every logical item and itself. In translating identity into that tautologous relation, A equals A, the principle ignores the proper dialectical meaning of identity, its character as a category of essence. Right? So this is just the point that I made before. Numerical identity, whether it's of objects or predicates, is just completely independent of the notion of essence. You can have that on the table even though you have no concept of essence. Or one way of thinking about that is, in the period when analytic philosophers were deeply suspicious of the notion of essence, they had no problem with numerical identity as a logical notion. And that just shows that that notion of numerical identity is not the essence logical notion of identity that Hegel has in mind. But that means that these principles aren't about the logical category itself. Right? So Hegel thinks the principles properly should be understood as principles about the category, about identity. And I don't have this on the handout. He says at a certain point that all of these categories of reflection all implicitly contain a principle about themselves. So each of them, in a certain sense, contains in itself a principle about itself, but they aren't these common logical principles. Everything is self-identical. Okay, so these principles aren't about the logical category, identity. So they require another subject, and they supply as that subject everything, which has the effect of making them tacit generalizations about every being. But Hegel's principles are about identity and difference and contradiction themselves. Now, at this point, we might worry, well, does this make them merely conceptual or merely logical? Are these merely points about concepts? That isn't a worry we need to have. Or at least that worry is misplaced at this point in the logic, because logic coincides with metaphysics, as Hegel tells us in the Encyclopedia Logic, which he hints at in the introduction to the science of logic. And the way I understand that, and this is obviously the topic of could be the topic of a much larger conversation, is that the categories of logic are also the ontological categories of being. So it isn't that we're uncovering some logical structure and then we have to worry, well, does the ontological structure of being mirror that? How can we have access to the ontological categories of being? I think Hegel thinks there's simply an isomorphism between the categories of logic and the ontological categories of being. And that raises the question of his grounds for thinking there's such an isomorphism. Is that just assumed or presupposed by Hegel? I don't think that it is. I think that the point of Hegel's logic is that that coincidence or that isomorphism between thinking and being is in a certain sense completely trivial, because the contrary to it is unthinkable. When you really take seriously the idea that the categories of logic are categories of thinking, then it's not thinkable that being might fail to be cut up according to them, because in putatively thinking that, you are violating the thing you just admitted, namely that these are categories of thought. So that's a little capsule version of my explanation of why the logic coincides with metaphysics for Hegel. So that means in uncovering the logical relations among the categories identity and difference in thought, we're thereby uncovering the ontological or metaphysical relations among identity and difference in beings. So there's sort of real ontological structure, identity and difference, which is completely isomorphic to the logical relations between identity and difference. And that's why we don't have to put everything in these angle brackets, right? In the strictest sense, in the logic, we should make clear that we're always talking about categories. But because being is transparent to the categories, we can translate unproblematically between angle bracket talk and non-angle bracket talk. Or another way of putting that is there is no systematic use mention error in the logic. Right? The logic wouldn't have been better if Hegel had put scare quotes throughout the book about being. Because in talking about being and talking about the category understood as a category of thought, Hegel is just thereby always already talking about the ontological category. And let me just say, just to fend off a possible objection, by describing logic as coinciding with the ontological categories of being, I don't mean to be denying that being is the least determinate, least informative, most empty characterization of ontology. It's just the name of the topic. The most uninformative, the least informative thing you can say about it is being. The point of the logic is to say all the more determinate things about it. Okay. So now I've talked about identity. Now I'm going to go through difference. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go into the details of all of the transitions within the category of difference, but I do want to briefly mention them. And I'll just admit there are a lot of things about the identity difference contradiction sections in the science of logic that I don't understand. And that will become apparent at a few points. There's some of these transitions among different kinds of difference, I don't think I have a fully worked out adequate account. Okay. So the most important subcategory within difference is absolute difference, because that is the category to which the transition from identity is immediately made. Hegel writes in The Science of Logic, difference is the negativity that reflection possesses in itself. The nothing which is said in identical speaking, identische Sprechen, the essential movement of identity itself, which as the negativity of itself, at the same time determines itself, it is differentiated from difference. So I just want to note, Di Giovanni translates identische Sprechen as identity discourse, which is not as literal or exactly buchstäblich as I've done here, but I think actually captures what Hegel means better than my very literal translation. So how do I understand this? The negativity that reflection possesses in itself is the negativity that thought thinks in thinking reflection. What is it for thought to think reflection? It's to think the relation between essence and Schein. Why is that the negativity the reflection possesses in itself? Because reflection is just a determination of thought. So to say that reflection possesses it in itself is just to think that thought in thinking reflection thinks that negativity. The two levels are completely isomorphic to one another. So the negativity that reflection possesses in itself is the negativity that thought thinks just in thinking reflection, which is the negativity that thought thinks in thinking essence. Because whenever we think essence, we have to think the relation, the reflection of essence in its Schein. What is the nothing which is said in identity discourse? I take that to mean, so what is identity discourse or identical speaking, identische Sprechen? Whenever we talk about essence, we have to use a nothing. We have to say essence is identical to itself and nothing else. The essence of the thing, to be this thing is to be this and nothing else. So the idea is that in talking about the essence of being, we always have to differentiate it negatively from what it is not. Just to sum up, the thought of identity is the thought of essence as identical to itself and nothing else. So it's the thought that differentiates the essence of being from what it isn't. And once again, just to fix topics, the examples here would be the second proposition of Fichte's Grundlage, in which I distinguish myself from what I'm not. So the first idea is pure indeterminate self-identity of the I, and then the difference between the I and the not-I. And then in Schelling's 1801 Darstellung, it's, I think, paragraph 23, where we first get from this completely self-identical conception of the absolute to the first notion of difference between subject and object. Now, background, which I'm not going to go into this talk, part of Hegel's philosophical project, I take it, is to show that, or to argue that that movement from pure indeterminate self-identity to difference is arbitrary or shot out of a cannon in Fichte and Schelling. That's a version of the idea that no one has a solution to the acosmism problem except for him. if you start with the completely indeterminate conception of the absolute, you don't get out of the completely indeterminate conception of the absolute unless you conceive of the absolute purely logically or in purely Hegelian logical terms, argues Hegel. So if you're wondering, where does that shot from pure indeterminate self-identity to difference come from in Fichte and Schelling, I think Hegel's answer is precisely, it comes from nowhere, it's just injected. And that's undermines the systematic ambitions of those versions of idealism. Okay, so now then we get diversity. Difference has both these moments, identity and difference. Difference, in as much as it has two such moments, which are themselves reflections into themselves, is diversity. Now, how I read this, I think diversity is the diversity of the two moments of identity and difference, or it's the difference between identity and difference. I think that is more or less what Hegel says there, and I am encouraged by the fact that, as far as I can tell, Richard Dean Wingfield, who did not seem to come today, also reads diversity the same way. So the harder thing, and I have to admit, I don't at some level fully understand this, is to understand why identity and difference are said to be reflected into themselves or indifferent to one another. Hegel says repeatedly, most clearly in Encyclopedia Logic, that diverse items are indifferent to one another. If we go the other direction and take diversity to be the relation between things that are different, we get the same problem. Identity is different from difference, so identity and difference are diverse, but why are they indifferent? They seem like they're the very opposite of indifferent. It seems like each of them is constituted by its relationship to the other. Hegel then says something that I think in some ways a deeply important remark: difference is the whole and its own moment, just as ideality equally is its whole and its moment. Now, the way I understand that, and I have to admit my diagram drawing powers in Microsoft Word are not great, and secondly, these diagrams I think aren't terribly informative. The idea is there's identity as a whole, or sort of identity as the place where this arrow originates. And identity contains within itself both itself and difference in negative relation. So we have identity as a whole, and then when we unpack that, we get the difference between identity and difference. Or another way of saying that is identity distinguishes itself from difference. And likewise, difference is the name both for the whole and one of the moments within itself. Difference differentiates itself from identity. That's what I take that claim to mean. Difference is the whole at its own moment, just as identity equally is its whole at its moment. But what I don't understand is why this makes them indifferent to one another, since each seems to be embedded in the other infinitely, because we can, after all, just map this diagram over onto difference, and then we would have identity and difference differentiating themselves from each other. And that looks to me like it would be the opposite of indifference. It looks like each of them would be what it is constitutively through its negative relation to the other. So there's something I don't understand about diversity. Now, then we get another category within diversity, likeness and unlikeness. Italicize those, which I take to be externally reflected similarity between diverse items. Or another way of saying that is, between diverse items, we can observe similarities. And they're external because they aren't themselves, the thought of them as such isn't that comparison. That comparison is independent or indifferent to the thought of them as the things that they are. So we can just notice, oh, identity and difference have certain structural parallels. The corresponding principle, right, is that every being is diverse, or no two beings that are different, have the same determinations. So that's what we get when we abstract the category of diversity from its properly logical context and predicate it of everything. But the properly logical principle about categories, because the properly logical principles about the categories, is that the different are diverse, or every pair of distinct beings is diverse. Right? So sorry, the properly logical category is is difference. The different are diverse. Different categories are diverse. And that is mistakenly translated into a principle about every being. Every pair of distinct beings is diverse. Hegel's main point, right? So the main thing is that this distorts the logical meaning of diversity, which is that identity and difference are themselves diverse. Now, there's also a discussion of the principle of identity of indiscernibles in this section, but I don't want to get into that because I think at some level, Hegel cares less about the identity of indiscernibles than he cares about this logical principle about the relation among categories. Okay, so now, although identity and difference, the moments of diversity, have been characterized as indifferent to one another, difference was introduced as the negation of identity, what identity is not. So that means that initially identity is introduced as positive and difference as negative, as not identity. But that also means we can distinguish identity as indifferently neither positive nor negative from identity as positive. We can distinguish identity on its own from identity as the positive negatively related to the negative, namely difference. And the analogy, the arithmetical analogy, is we can think of a number, a whole number, as neither positive nor negative, just as a whole number, versus when we introduce negative numbers, we then represent it as a positive number. But conversely, we could start from negative numbers and think of the positive numbers as the negative of those negative numbers. But I don't want to spend too much time in the arithmetical analogy. The important thing is that we could just as well think of difference as the positive and think of identity as its negative. So we could define difference as the negative of identity. We could also define identity as the negative of difference. So we have this notion of positive and negative, but then identity and difference are indifferent to which fills the role. Now we got the thing that we're really interested in. I realize I'm not doing very well on time, so I'll skip a few things. Contradiction. So here's a relatively long passage, which I will read out. Difference as such, so Überhaupt, I think it's as such is the right translation in this context. Difference as such is already the contradiction in itself. For it is the unity of those that are only insofar as they are not one, and the separation of those which are only insofar as they are separated in the same relation. The positive and the negative, however, are the posited contradiction, for they are themselves as negative unities, the positing of themselves, and therein each is the sublation of itself and the positing of its opposite. Now here's how I read that. The category of contradiction expresses an implicit contradiction between identity and difference. Sorry, that should be difference, not diversity. That's what it means by difference as such is already the contradiction an sich. But that contradiction is more explicit in the case of positive and negative. Or positive and negative are the positive contradiction. They're the contradiction made explicit. The contradiction is that identity is not difference. Identity and difference are different, but that identity and difference are also identical. Equivalently, the positive is not the negative, and the positive is the negative. Now, as always in Hegel's logic, that's supposed to be a contradiction among these categories, given the categories we have so far, given the state or the moment or the level of actualization of thinking up to that point in the logic. That contradiction will be resolved at the next level or stage of logic, the next level of actualization of thinking. The argument is that given the categories we have so far, there is no difference between identity and difference. But there is a difference between them because they're defined by their difference. Now, because Hegel is arguing that thought equipped with these categories and no others has to think a contradiction, it would be question begging to assert that identity is different from difference in order to distinguish them. It would be question begging because Hegel is admitting identity is different from difference. But that doesn't non-question beggingly show that it's not also identical to difference. So we can't say, well, identity and difference can't be identical, they're different from one another. That would be to beg the question. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to explain why the positive and negative stayed in this contradictory relationship, and use that to explain why identity and difference were implicitly contradictory all along. So let's start from so Greg, I'm planning on, can I go until 15 past? Because we got started a little late.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine by me if it's fine by others.
Okay.
We'll just have we'll just have less time for questions as long as you're okay with that.
I'm fine with that.
All right.
So let's start from a familiar Hegelian observation, or what I think of as a familiar Hegelian observation. Positive and negative are names for positions in a system of relations, the bearers of which can be interchanged. The roles are indifferent to possible difference in what fills the role, and consequently the role fillers are indifferent to those roles. That's one of the points of force and understanding in phenomenologic spirit. Question, how does that generate a contradiction? Well, now ask ourselves, what is the positive? Natural answer, the positive is the opposite of the negative. Opposition, by the way, is the categorical name for the relation positive and negative. The corresponding answer is that the negative is the opposite of the positive. But we've already used the positive to define the negative. This definition is circular. If we combine them, we get the positive is the opposite of the positive, or the positive is the positive. That's completely indeterminate. It tells us nothing about the positive. Likewise, we could start with the negative, define the positive in terms of it, etc., and we would just get back to the negative is the negative. All we've said about either of them is that they're self-identical and different from what they're not. And that means we've said the same thing about both. Hegel says both are accordingly the positive contradiction. Both are in themselves the same. Or likewise, when we might define the positive through this abstract schema, it's that such that it is defined through its negative relation to not it, but the same schema could be filled out with the negative just as well as the positive. So the lesson from this is that using only the categories positive and negative and difference, we cannot think the difference between positive and negative consistent. We can't say what they are in such a way that they are different. We will have to think of them as different because they're defined by their negative relation, but we also have to think of them as the same because everything we say about one, we say about the other. To say the difference between the positive and negative, we need a new category. Now, intuitively, the positive and the negative are asymmetrically related. The positive is more fundamental than the negative, or the negative is the privation. So that suggests that the way to resolve this is to introduce a category that expresses an asymmetric relation between positive and negative. And I think that asymmetric relation is the next category, ground. Okay. So that's the explicit contradiction in positive and negative. But now let's map that back onto the implicit contradiction between identity and difference. The same points can be made about identity and difference. What is identity? Initially, it's pure self-identity, completely indeterminate. But that doesn't tell us what identity is because it's precisely completely indeterminate. Identity only attains its determinacy through a negative relation to what it is not, namely difference. Well, what is identity? It's the negation of difference, but difference is the negation of identity. So that gets us back to identity as identity. Likewise, if we take difference as primitive, or we take identity as primitive and define difference through it, we just get difference is difference. So if we define identity in terms of difference, we get that it is self-identical and different from its negation. If we define difference in terms of identity, we get that it is self-identical and different from its negation. In either cases, our definitions are totally indeterminate and identical to one another. Hegel's point is to say what identity is and how it is different from difference. To define identity, you need categories different than identity and difference. And intuitively, the identical and the different are asymmetrically related. The identical is more fundamental than the different. The different is the manifestation or emanation of the identity. So we need a new category to think the asymmetric relation between identity and difference. And I want to suggest, but not defend in this course, this talk, because I don't have a complete account of it, that asymmetrical relation is expressed through the category of ground. So one way of thinking about this is Hegel is uncovering the inner logical structure of Fichte's 1794 Grundlage and Schelling's 1801 Darstellung. We have to think the absolute I, the indifference point, not only as pure being. We start out by thinking as pure being. We also start about thinking of it as purely self-identical. But then we also have to think of it as the ground of its determinate differences. So what Hegel is doing is uncovering all of the categories that were implicitly taken for granted by other versions of idealism in thinking the absolute and getting them in the proper logical order. Okay, I'm just going to very quickly move through this objections and replies section. You might think you can give purely logical definitions of identity and distinctness. I think that there's no reason to think that those are definitions of identity and distinctness. Those look like structural descriptions of identity and distinctness. There's no reason to think that those pick out a single relation. You might think, well, identity and difference can at least be differentiated. That is to say, identity is symmetric and difference is anti-symmetric. I don't think that's right, because I think Hegel thinks that identity and difference are both symmetric, because everything is identical to itself and also different from itself, because the point of the essence logic is to get us away from thinking that the difference between the essence of a thing and its shine is like a difference between two beings, between two sets of properties, and to get us towards recognize that it's a distinction with within one being, between how the being is and what a being is and how it is. So I just don't think that Hegel thinks that identity and difference, that identity is reflexive and difference is non-reflexive. He thinks both of them are reflexive and both of them are symmetric. So from those purely structural descriptions of the relation, they're indistinguishable. And then finally, you might think, who cares if identity can't be circularly defined? Just take it as a primitive notion. But the whole point of Hegel's logic is so from Hegel's point of view, taking identity as primitive is assuming that the meaning of identity is given to us immediately. That is to say, not mediated by other logical categories. And the whole project of the logic is to do without such appeals to immediate givenness, or to demonstrate that appeals to such givenness end in complete indeterminacy. So what you're trying to do in logic, or what's a satisfactory view in logic might depend on your logical project. And I think Hegel's logical project is one in which taking identity as primitive, or not trying to say what identity is unacceptable. And the point of this section is that identity and difference can't define one another on their own. An attempt to define identity and difference just using identity and difference leads to a contradiction. Okay. So what's the larger moral of this section? Well, the issue in this chapter is the identity and difference and contradictory relation between identity and difference themselves. But identity and difference, and of course contradiction, have been topics in the logic so far. We've been implicitly using the categories of reflection all along. For instance, positing, et cetera, et cetera. So we have finally caught up to some of the categories we need to do the logic at all. Or quite in general in the logic, we use categories to do the logic that aren't yet available at that level of the logic. One way that you can tell that is there are essence logical categories all through from the very beginning in the logic of being. Categories like mediation, categories like identity and difference are always there. That's an articulation, or that's an expression of the fact that those earlier parts of the logic are self-contradictory on their own or impossible on their own. The logic is the articulation of the categories of thinking, but logic is also an exercise of thinking. So we need to use the categories in determining the very categories themselves in logic. Or we need to think identity and difference using identity and difference themselves, as well as the previous categories unfolded up to that point in the logic itself, which are, in the case of identity and difference, either just categories of being, which are not useful, or they're the categories of essence, or sorry, the categories of shine, which I think are used in the identity and difference section, but can't be used to differentiate identity and difference. So at every point in the logic, we've been thinking the identity and difference of categories. We think of them determinately as the categories they are, or we think their identity, through their negative relation to others, their difference. The argument of the logic at each stage has been that the two categories defined through their negative relation are the same, are identical, unless some further category is introduced. For instance, being is nothing, or the infinite is finite, etc. So identity and difference recapitulates that general structure, but in a reflected or essence logical fashion. It's indifferent to the qualitative being logical categories, or qualitative/being logical categories that stand in relations of identity and difference. So previously we thought the identity and difference among various being logical categories. Now we are reflecting on the very categories of identity and difference themselves. In the doctrine of being, we thought the contradictory relations of identity and difference among categories of quality, quantity, and measure. But now we think the contradictory relations among those very relations of identity and difference themselves. Hegel says in a Zusatz to the Encyclopedia Logic, because the one concept is the substantial element in everything, the same determinations surface in the development of the essence as in the development of being, but in reflected form. Hence, instead of being and nothing, the forms of the positive and the negative now enter. The former initially corresponding to the oppositionless being as identity, the latter as difference. So these categories map onto the beginning of the logic, being and nothing. But that also means the contradiction in this chapter has the same reflective status. It is a contradiction between an identity and difference, but it's also the category of contradiction that applies, subsumes, explains, and reflects all of the previous contradictions uncovered so far in the logic. In particular, the contradiction between being and nothing. So this entails that contradiction in general is a contradiction in the identity and difference of categories. An example of that is that being is identical to and different from nothing. This is one reason why the different order of categories in the science of logic and the Encyclopedia Logic might be important. In the science of logic, we get the sequence identity, difference, contradiction. That maps to being, nothing, becoming. While in the Encyclopedia Logic, it's identity, difference, ground. So the difference then is whether contradiction or ground is becoming in reflected form. Now, becoming is repeatedly characterized as the contradictory relation of being and nothing. Hegel says it contradicts itself in itself, but to my knowledge, it's never characterized in terms of ground. So that would suggest that identity, difference, contradiction. That suggests that the science of logic order of categories is right. But on the other hand, if that's right, if mapping becoming to contradiction is right, that entails that Dasein gets mapped to ground rather than existence, or what Di Giovanni calls concrete existence, which would be more natural, not only on etymological grounds. So that suggests a reason why there's a difference between the science of logic and the Encyclopedia Logic. Hegel is genuinely unsure how he wants these categories to line up. On the one hand, he wants contradiction to map to becoming. On the other hand, he wants Dasein to map to existence. And he can't have both. Okay, so now let me now return to what this talk was actually about, the status of the principle of contradiction in the contradiction chapter. So recall the principles that correspond to the categories here. Identity maps to principle of identity, everything is identical. Diversity maps to the principle of diversity. If A and B are distinct, then they're diverse. Opposition, which I didn't go through, maps to the principle of excluded middle. Everything either has the positive determination or the negative determination. These principles distort the meaning of the category by being formal and being generalizations over all beings rather than principles about the categories in themselves. Applying this to contradiction, the common logical principle of contradiction, nothing is A and not A, is formal and generalizes over all beings rather than being a principle about the categories themselves, namely that identity and difference themselves are contradictory or in the relation of contradiction. If we take the principle of contradiction to be a principle that generalizes over every individual being, it should read instead, everything is contradictory, as Hegel makes explicit. The principle of contradiction that you would derive in this kind of flat-footed way from the logic would not be the one we're familiar with. It would be its negation. Not its negation, it would be the even stronger thing. Everything is contradictory. And that's why the more familiar principle of contradiction actually corresponds to the principle of identity from earlier. Why? Because in order to think any being, we have to think of it using identity and difference. In order to think any being, we have to think of it as identical to itself and different from other beings. But Hegel has just argued that those categories themselves are contradictory. So to think of any being, we have to think contradictory thoughts about it. So every individual being is contradictory. It's something that we could derive at this stage in the logic. But that is a less important point. That's downstream, just as the self-identity of every being is downstream of the more basic point about the contradictory relation among the categories. Since the categories are categories involved in any thought of any being, they generalize to all beings. But the fundamental level here is the level of the categories themselves, not their consequences for all beings. What do we do once we reach contradiction, the contradiction section? We try to resolve it. Why do we do that? Well, the answer to that can't have been proved for the first time in the contradiction section. It can't have been proved for the first time in the contradiction section that contradictions require thinking to move forward. If we did prove for the first time in the contradiction section that contradictions require thinking to move forward, to resolve a contradiction, rather than just to say, and we're done, everything's contradictory, then the movement up of the logic up to that point would be undermined. There would be no way to get to the contradiction section. Or another way of saying that is that section would not be mediated by thinking. Right? We would just be shot out of a cannon. There would be no logical mediation up to that point. There would be no logical movement, properly speaking, up to that point. So in some sense, the need to resolve contradictions has to have been present all along in the logic from the start. By parity of reasoning, so I've just argued that the reason why contradictions need to be resolved can't have been proven for the first time in the contradiction section. I think by parity of reasoning, that shows that it can't have been proven at any particular point in the logic, or any point in the logic to which movement has occurred. So it has to be there from the start. But if it has been presupposed from the start, I don't want to say it's been presupposed, if it's been present in thought all along, what is the role of the contradictions? It's to bring the implicit role of contradiction into the level of explicit logical reflection. It's to do for contradiction what the identity section does for identity. And this is the point in the logic where thought catches up with itself with respect to identity, difference, and contradiction. It now explicitly posits thought determinations that it has been implicitly employing all along: identity, difference, and contradiction. Which means that the answer to my original question, what is the status of the principle of contradiction in logic? The deep status of the principle of contradiction, not the common logical principle, nothing is contradictory, everything is contradictory, but the role of the requirement that contradictions be resolved in the logic precisely cannot be answered in the contradiction section itself. So my talk has a satisfyingly Hegelian structure. The very ambition to do what it set out to do cannot be satisfied. My talk is something like one of the shapes of consciousness in the phenomenology of spirit. It suffers its own contradiction. So whatever the answer whatever the answer is to the question of the status of the need to resolve contradictions in logic, it can't be answered by looking at what Hegel says about contradiction. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. Graham, do you want to moderate per usual? We can't hear you, Graham. You're muted.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Greg.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'll keep an eye on YouTube here as well.
Okay.
And let me just preface this by saying there are a lot of details of these sections that I don't understand. So a lot of questions are going to be of the form. The answer to a lot of my questions are going to be, I myself am not sure about why that happens exactly that way in identity difference contradiction. We can look at the text, which is like the philosophy equivalent of looking at the instant replay, but I'm not sure that in the next hour we're going to come to a mutually satisfactory understanding of what's going on in that text.
Okay, Nick, can you take your screen down so that we can see each other?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got just over 45 minutes. So please keep your questions short. I'm going to take the first question, then shut up. So, Nick, this is on the topic of dialetheism. And you've said that contradictions have to be resolved, and that was your word. I take it that that's your translation of Aufheben, right? There's a question of whether when a contradiction is aufgehoben, it's gotten rid of. I mean, there's this ambiguity in the notion. What you said was interesting, because what you're indicating is that you get this contradiction, and it's sort of contradiction in logician sense, and it won't do what it's meant to do. You need a new concept to do that, to explain the difference between identity and difference and so on. When I talked about the dialectic a few weeks ago, when you weren't there to hear it, but what I suggested was that it's the appearance of the new concept at this point, which counts as resolving the contradiction of the old concept. And it doesn't get rid of them. It just expresses what the contradiction said before consistently in a more adequate way. So the old contradiction is present, expressed in the old concepts, but the new concept is better because it's a more adequate understanding of whatever it is you're talking about. So I hear what you say is actually a reason why Hegel doesn't need the principle of non-contradiction. He just has to explain where this new category comes from and why the new category does the job better than the old categories did.
Yeah, so better in what sense? What's the sense of more adequate?
More detailed, if you like. It can say things that the old categories couldn't do. So in your example, identity and difference themselves can't explain the difference, the relationship between the two. You need this more generous concept to explain what's going on between those two categories.
Yeah, I mean, so Hegel in general doesn't just say that the original contradiction is aufgehoben in the next category. He also says that it's resolved, and I believe I'm now blanking on the German. I believe it's aufgelöst. So it's not just sublation; it's also resolution. Thirdly, whether the sublated contradiction is still there that's a hard question to answer, because we need an account of what it would be for the contradiction to still be there or still be present. So that's the hard thing to answer. I want to push against the idea that the new category, the way to understand the role of the new categories in terms of adequacy or detail, because those are matters of degree. And that means that no particular category is required, because, or another way of putting that is, that suggests that the principle of movement in the logic is something like maximization of a magnitude. And that is precisely the kind of principle of movement that Hegel finds in Fichte and wants to get rid of, right? So the principle of movement in Fichte is this impossible regulative ideal of asymptotically approaching the absolute I. If the principle of movement in the logic was getting a more adequate or more detailed way of expressing previous contradictions, that wouldn't be as much of an advance beyond Fichte as Hegel wants to have. So we have to say something more than that the new category is more detailed or is more adequate. I think that if we look at the passages where Hegel precisely says, I mean, in that passage of the Encyclopedia Logic that I quoted, he says immediately before I read that, and I thought, Graham must love this passage. He says, the claim that contradictions cannot be thought is laughable. Okay? So there are all these famous passages. There's the excessive tenderness for the world passage. There's the laughability passage. He always says, look, what are you kidding me? Contradictions can't be thought. We think of them all the time. But then he immediately goes on to say, what's right about that is we can't just be satisfied with a contradiction. We have to resolve it. We have to fix it in some way, and that thing itself will generate another contradiction, which then has to be resolved. I think the clear sense of those passages is that the second contradiction, it maybe is in some sense present, but it has to be in some sense fixed, or its contradictory character has to be some sense fixed, or else the rhetoric of those passages, where Hegel seems to be granting something to the defenders of the principle of contradiction, would be undermined. And merely sort of having a more adequate way or a more detailed way of expressing a contradiction, I don't think gives enough to the defenders of the principle of contradiction and doesn't give enough weight to the resolution language, and would not be enough of an advance beyond Fichte.
Okay, thanks, Nick. I'll put myself on the end of the queue if we get there, but in fairness, I'm going to pass on. Next question, Toby.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. This was very helpful. And I do like to start with saying that the question on the difference between the encyclopedia and the Guetta logic in terms of the category of contradiction is absolutely demanding. Secondary literature does not do enough justice to this asymmetry.
Richard,
very important. Yeah,
do you have a view about this? Have you written about this?
If I have a view on this, yes, I do. Okay. Maybe I can tell something about this later in the end of my question, because I like this question, but I also like to say that I'm a bit skeptical about your reading in terms of I see Hegel as deconstructing the very idea of understanding identity as essence. This is wrong from a Hegel point of view, because essence means self-sameness, and identity is always the identity of identity and difference. I mean, this is like the political claim he made very early in his work, but I think the entire Greater Logics is an attempt to spell out this very idea. So as self-sameness, A equals A, is super abstract, is understanding, it's not concrete identity. And concrete identity is this relation that we have to spell out. And I think therefore we need the categories of identity and difference. And now my question comes to this reconstruction that you gave in terms for the difference of diversity, opposition, and contradiction in terms of the Greater Logics. And I think that there is one term missing in your reconstruction, which is totality, because diversity, they don't constitute a totality. So you see this if you have a look on the inferential conclusions that you can draw. So if A and whatever it is, non-A or B, better said, if that is diverse, from saying something is A, you can infer that it's not B. But from non-B A, you cannot infer that it's B. So there's a difference, because it could be a C. There is a law of the excluded middle is always applicable in diversity. That's very different to opposition. Opposition, they constitute a totality, but it's still either or. Still, the law of non-contradiction is in a place. And this is a very different of contradiction. Contradictions now, they kind of open up for the space of A and B changing what they are essentially or substantially by their relating. So this is kind of concrete. It's a different form of negation. And I think this is understandable from an ethical point of view. So that's why I said that this is a deconstruction of the very idea of understanding identity as self-sameness. So it's more critical to, as I understood your point of view and what I find in Hegel. It's more saying, okay, we need to move on and have a different understanding of identity. And this is the speculative one. And to give some grounds for this great claim that I just made, by the very end of the logics, when it comes to speak of the method, I mean, all these appraisals that he gives to dialectics does not fit into a picture of understanding contradiction as what we need to resolve. We have to find a method which is capable of rendering the contradictions productive. Right. So it's not, that's different idea of resolving them. We will always have contradictions because theory is about life. Life is contradictory in itself. So how to make sense of this? This is a question.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, a couple points. One, I agree that totality is very important here, but at least in encyclopedia logic, Hegel makes it very clear that totality is the characteristic of ground. So somehow the totality character of ground is what resolves identity and difference in the encyclopedia logic. Now, that having been said, I don't have I'm not at all satisfied with anything that I have to say about ground, or even the things that I said about ground in this talk. So I do think that totality is somehow playing an important role here. I think it's more the thing that's to come that's going to resolve these problems. Second of all, one of the things that I heard you saying is that that somehow the role of totality is you can have contraries which aren't contradictories. That is to say, two things that are incompatible, but they don't exhaust the logical space. That's a very productive thought. That's something that I should think more about. I don't have anything off the top of my head to say about the role of that in the way that I'm thinking about these things, but that's definitely something that I will think about. Thirdly, I think there's less of a difference between the way we're thinking about contradiction here than you might think, or the way we're thinking about identity, because identity is self-sameness at the start. The first sort of immediate shape of identity is just the self-sameness of essence. Then when we unpack that, it has internal to itself difference. So there's never going to be properly, Hegelian speaking, identity without difference within it. So that's less of a difference between us than it might seem. And then this issue about resolving contradictions versus making them productive, that I think really is no difference between us, because resolving a contradiction is making that contradiction productive, namely that you just don't end with the contradiction, but you don't end with just the pure indeterminate nothing of a contradiction classically conceived. It's a specific contradiction that requires a specific new category to resolve it, which means that it is productive in the sense that it is the principle of movement. It's literally how the logic produces itself. It's how you get the next thing. And then the question about whether the logic ends with this big happy resolution of all the contradictions or not. I don't have a completely settled view on this, but my instincts are to agree, or to say something that I think is more in the line of what I hear you saying than might seem. Namely, I don't think that the absolute idea is this new category or set of categories that resolves all the contradictions. I think the absolute idea, I think the logic ends where it began, which means all you do is resolve contradictions, move on. And insofar as there's an absolute idea, insofar as there's something that isn't contradictory and isn't limited by anything outside of itself, it's the movement of the logic within the logic. And that resolves all the contradictions, but in this either unsatisfying or perfectly satisfying, depending on how you think about it, way in which you only ever resolve one contradiction by getting another contradiction. and then eventually you just get back to the contradiction you started with. Or you go on to the philosophy of nature, and then you think all the contradictions in the philosophy of nature. So I don't think of Hegel as someone who has a single findable, statable theory that resolves all the contradictions. I think that the analog, or what is absolute, or Hegel's view, is the thing that really matters is the principle of movement among the categories. So I don't think there's as much of a difference between us as maybe you think. The ethical status of all of this is something on which I simply have no views. That's very much not what I try as much as possible to just restrict myself to pure logic and metaphysics in all of philosophy. There is obviously a kind of ethical significance to the logic, because it is, after all, the logic of the categories of right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's even ethical content in the logic itself, but about that, I will have to remain silent.
Okay, Elna.
Thank you, Nick, for the very, very clear talk. Actually, it was given the difficulty of talking and explaining Hegel's logic, talking about Hegel's logic. I find it clear, but I still think that it is a really difficult task to talk about Hegel's logic, to talk about the development of the categories in Hegel's logic, to teach Hegel's logic. And so I have some methodological questions. So the first is that the methodological question. You said that historical, so reference to the history of philosophy is not helpful for teaching Hegel's logic or for talking about Hegel's logic.
What I said is it's of limited help. I said it's of a limited but non-zero help.
Yes, I can understand because if one says, okay, we can understand Hegel's notion of being if we look at Parmenides, but then you have the problem to have a shared view about what Parmenides thought, right? Which is not always the case in philosophy and in philosophical debates. Yeah. But in any case, so I understand why you say this, and you also say we have to understand Hegel and Hegel's logic in its own terms. So, and you gave an example of trying to understand Hegel's logic in its own terms. So my idea is, in a way, if we did what Hegel did in his own terms, then we should work also historical about him, because when he talked about other authors, he did it in a very historical way. So he always considered what came before, what came after, what were the views in his own time that were held about those authors. So in a way, you are doing something else than Hegel did, because you are working on a historical text in a way which could be better, perhaps better than the way Hegel used for working on historical texts. So that's the first very external, very methodological question. I'm doing it because you did it, because you said you opened up the field, yeah. Because you okay.
Can I respond? Should I answer that?
But
should I answer that? Should I answer that question now? Yeah. So I don't want to. I think you're hearing me as being more skeptical of reading the logic through its historical references than I am. In that I think it is in fact incredible. I mean, the science of logic really only opened up for me when I thought of it in relation to Spinoza and Fichte and Schelling. And I think that is especially Spinoza, Parmenides, Fichte, Schelling, it's just enormously helpful to think of the logic in those terms. However, the topic of none of the chapters of the logic, except for the remarks, of course, are particular historical authors. Just an example. Parmenides is not the topic of the chapter on being, because no particular philosopher in the history of philosophy, aside from Hegel, has thought Hegel's categories in their total purity, except for Hegel. When you look at historical philosophers, you get particular logical categories mixed up, not in exactly the right logical order. Parmenides on being and nothing might actually be the clearest case where someone came as close as possible to just getting exactly the Hegelian categories in order, but everyone else gets them all jumbled up. And here's a great example of that. In a certain way, the science of logic is the logical X-ray of the structure of Fichte's Foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre. But if you look at the Foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre, you get the absolute I is pure being, is self-identical, is the ground, posits, is self-determining, all at once. And so every, multiple stages of the science of logic are about those categories that Fichte thinks the absolute I under immediately, just all at once. So the topic of none of the chapters of the science of logic can be Fichte's Foundation of the entire Wissenschaft. What it has, the topic is the categories, which among other categories, Fichte thinks in the absolute I from the very beginning. So we, let a thousand flowers bloom. Sometimes it's extremely helpful to think of a particular chapter in the science of logic through its historical references. However, those historical references can never be the topic of that, or immediately or purely be the topic of that chapter. Furthermore, the argument of the science of logic always has to work on its own terms. It has to show that thought in thinking this category must think these other things. That someone else thought accordingly is irrelevant, strictly speaking, to the logical argument of the logic. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, sure. I agree with you. Probably there are here different approaches or different understanding of what it means to have a historical approach to something. What I wanted to know, for example, is how do you approach? What is your position? What are, for example, the authors that are relevant for you in order to read Hegel, to understand Hegel? How do you position yourself within the discussions about, for example, the logic of essence? And or another question is the question of but I perhaps I can ask you the more the other question, the more internal question, you said, you quoted a very nice passage about the fact that the contradiction is not all there is to it, or that the matter is not at an end with the contradiction, because you wanted to stress your point, namely that Hegel wants to resolve the contradiction. Yep. And what would you say is this not being at an end from a logical point of view? Logically, what would you say? What is it? The matter is not at an end with the contradiction.
So it's this weird German idiom, sein Bewenden haben, I think. It's just there's no direct translation to English. It means like, you're not finished. So are you asking me where would logic be finished?
Yeah, what does it mean to be logically finished?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a great question. That's the question about where the logic ends, right? One way of thinking about the logic, so this is Dieter Henrich, of course, has this classic paper, Anfang und Methode der Logik. I think I want to write a paper about the end and the method of the logic, because this question of where the logic starts is, of course, how it could start. It's one of the most foundational questions of the logic. But I think there are equally hard questions about how the logic could ever end. And so here's one way of thinking about the way the logic ends. It should end with a category that has no contradictions. And the name of that category is the absolute idea. I don't think that can be Hegel's view, because any category has to be defined through its negative relation or its difference from something else. I think Hegel thinks, this isn't like a general theorem. Anything that's different from anything else stands in a contradictory relationship to it. How could you possibly prove that? I think Hegel thinks, though, that any such category that stands in negative relation to something else would, by definition, be finite, therefore not fit to be the absolutes, and be involved in contradiction in some way. So I don't think that the absolute idea, properly speaking, is the name of this big final category at the end that resolves all the contradictions. I think it's the name for what is truly absolute in Hegel, which is the self-movement of the logic. And the way that the final contradiction gets resolved is you can now do two things, right? So the logic ends by distinguishing pure thought from concrete being, and concrete being that's either in itself and not for itself, or in and for itself, namely nature and spirit. So now, at the end, thought can do two things. It can return to where it started and understanding them as contradictions, or it can think concrete being in itself, namely nature. There's a kind of, if the system is a circle of circles, then provably there's a point where one circle intersects another circle, and at that point, the movement can go in one of two directions. So you can either begin at the start back, go back to where you started, or you can then think the philosophy of nature and resolve more contradictions. So what does that mean if there's no category, if there's no one category that resolves all the contradictions, and it is just this cyclical thinking of all thinking of contradictions and resolutions of all contradictions? What does that mean for the sort of metaphysical consequences of the logic? I think it means that the absolute idea, which from one point of view is the most absolute in Hegel, from another point of view is an abstract absolute, so it's less absolute than absolute spirit. But let's stick with the logical notion of absolutehood, so it's the genuinely absolute. That means the absolute idea isn't a being or one big ontological structure. It's the self-moving nature of all the ontological structures. It's not that we start with the most indeterminate structure, and then we get more and more determinate structures, and then we get to the one final structural level that can be described completely non-contradictorily. It's we start with the most indeterminate structure, we get and then we go back to the beginning. And so now I've completely described the ontological structure of being, but I haven't described any totalizing being that is all of the ontological structures, or any one fundamental being. So it's a way of having a kind of, it's a kind of, I won't say anything more about that because I think I haven't thought through fully my views about this. So what that suggests is that there is no single stage in the logic at any point that resolves all the contradictions.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Franca.
Okay,
Franca, you're muted.
Okay. Sorry, because I had a meeting before, so I wasn't able to attend the first part of your talk. And so I don't want to, but I see you have quite a fairly definitive paper, and so if you can send it, I'd like to read it. I only wanted to say something about a small comment, possibly, and a question about the question of history, because and that Elena, I think that Elena found odd your position at the beginning, because I think she's referring to an idea, an hermeneutical idea of the use of history in philosophy. And from an hermeneutical point of view, the use of history has a strong methodological impact. So in the interpretation of Hegel, it is not the case of a comparison between Hegel and other philosophers. For instance, to see, yes, this is Spinoza, this is Fichte, and so on. It is not, this is the point. And it is not to check what Hegel actually thought about some philosopher or another. It is rather.
I'm going to need to rejoin this meeting on my phone.
Yeah. No, the question is
internet connection.
That the point
working.
Is how.
Hold on, Franca. Hold on. Nick needs to change his device.
Sorry?
Just hold on a second. Nick needs to change his device. He's got an internet problem.
Okay.
Yeah. Greg, I just
Got you back.
Yeah. Can you?
Nick
Okay.
reconnecting 1 second. He's reconnecting now. Let's see. I see Nick twice.
Okay.
1 second. Nick is doubled.
There's a double Nick.
He's back now.
Okay, are you back now, Nick?
Nick,
you're muted
is it
still, Nick.
right?
Sorry, can you mute yourself?
Nick, you're muted.
no, I'm muted. Okay, I'm sorry, Franca. Could you start your question from the beginning? It was you were already breaking up.
Yeah. Well, the point is about the problem of history in philosophy as a methodological, the method, historical method in philosophy and the interpretation of philosophers. I think that Elena's question was a bit oriented by an idea, a hermeneutical idea of the interpretation of a historical interpretation. And very briefly, an hermeneutical idea does not consist of thinking of checking of a comparison between Hegel and other philosophers, or of checking what Hegel thought about one or another philosopher in the past time, but how Hegel located himself within the history of philosophy. And how we locate ourselves in relation to him. So this is the hermeneutical approach. And what do you think about this? Because it is different from what you said before. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So once again, I don't think I'm disagreeing with anything anyone is saying, and I think maybe my remarks about the sort of limited helpfulness of thinking of the historical references of the logic are being slightly exaggerated. I just mean that if you want to understand the argument of the logic, it can't be reduced to what Hegel is saying about his historical predecessors. I certainly think this, the science of logic, everything written by Hegel should be understood in historical context. That's absolutely how I approach it. I think it's the way it should be approached. that having been said, I don't think that there's anything wrong, although I didn't do that in this talk, there's nothing wrong with comparing things across historical context and, asking, well, what does Hegel have to say to contemporary analytic philosophy, or, who is right? Like Hegel or David Lewis. I think that's a perfectly coherent question. They disagree, and both of them can't be right. So I don't think that the proper historical hermeneutical method in philosophy is incompatible with realism. Now, if your question is about, so I don't think that the proper hermeneutic historical approach to philosophical texts is incompatible with being a realist about them, and thinking that some of them are wrong and some of them are right, or at least they're not all right. Maybe none of them are right, but they can't, at least some of them have to be wrong. So we can still just ask, or another way of putting that is history and hermeneutics is not incompatible with truth claims. Now, if you're asking me about my view about our position in history relative to Hegel, I have sort of non-standard views about the history of philosophy since Hegel, which I won't go into any length. I'll just give the kind of advertisement version of it, which I think, Hegel says at some point, everyone wants to be beyond Kant now, but in fact, everyone has fallen behind Kant. I think that's still true. I think the lessons of classical German idealism, Kant most obviously, but Hegel as well, weren't refuted or surpassed. They were simply ignored by the, at least analytic philosophy. And so I think that to a large extent, what philosophy's done since Hegel is just pretend Hegel didn't exist, or pretend Hegel wasn't Hegel, or misread Hegel as a way of just, and then just find some other, another thing to do. So I have a kind of very negative view of this true philosophy since Hegel, but I won't go into that now. Some of you have heard me talk about this on a previous occasion, so I'll say it.
Okay, thanks. I think we should move on at this point because there's people still haven't spoken. So Greg, you're next.
Okay, thanks a lot for your talk, Nick. We only have a few minutes, so we can't answer all the questions I want to ask you in the few minutes we have. But yeah, I just wanted to ask you about there are some passages that kind of really struck my attention in the discussion of contradiction and ground that I wanted to ask you about, see if you have thoughts about them. And I'm particularly interested in how you understand the concept of ground, which you didn't have a lot of time to speak about today. And in relation to contradiction in particular. And I find these to be very slippery, and you've pointed that out in looking at the table of contents already. So this is not an objection so much as a question about further elucidation, questions for further reading. So there's just a couple passages that struck my attention. I was going back through this. One of the interesting passages, it connects with one of Toby's questions about the totality. Hegel says, he uses this phrase absolute contradiction, which is interesting. He talks about the absolute contradiction of the positive and the absolute contradiction of the negative. So there's this term absolute that qualifies contradiction in some places here. And so I'm interested in what you make of this. And then he also speaks about the self-subsistent aspect of negativity as self-contradictory. So I'm also interested in the self-contradiction, Selbstwidersprechendes, like how you understand this in connection to this idea of absolute contradiction. And so yeah, this term absolute, self-contradiction, and then I'm interested in these terms in relation to how he describes ground. He has a very, it's a difficult sentence, but he says the self-contradictory, self-subsistent opposition was itself therefore already ground. All that was added to it was the determination of self-unity. So that's all. You just add the self-unity. You already had the ground implicitly. So this is really slippery, right? So I'm really interested in what, if I don't know if you could say a little more about how you understand the relation of contradiction to ground, and what role, if any, self-contradiction, absolute, these terms play a role in that.
Yeah. Okay. So let me. That's a great and extremely hard question.
It's not much of a question, more of a, here are some really hard passages. Makes sense.
Here's some really hard passages that I didn't talk about.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me give my answers in order of from increasing unsatisfactoriness to hopefully less unsatisfactory. About ground, I just don't have anything that I want to say, because there's a sequel paper to this to be written on ground, and I just haven't written it, and so I just don't know what I think about ground, and I suspect so what that asymmetric stuff about ground was to a large extent just kind of a guess. The last time I read the ground sections, I had a very different way of thinking about all of this, and so I've had to kind of junk all of that. So I just don't know what I'm going to wind up wanting to say about ground at all. There is this feature sometimes in Hegel scholarship where you always push the problem to the previous section or the next section. You always say like, well, why is Hegel starting with these weird presuppositions? Oh, it's the previous section. Or like, what is going to resolve this weird view? Oh, that happens in the next one, right? It's always, pushing the problem to the day before or the day after. So I just don't know what I want to say about ground. As for the self-contradictory stuff, in a certain way, all of these, this is going to sound like a cop-out, or it sounds to me as I'm saying it like a cop-out. All of these contradictions are self-contradictions because they're contradictory relations among categories that are internal to the categories that stand in these relations. Yeah, exactly. So it's not that there's this thing called identity and it stands in a contradictory relation to something independent of it. The contradictory relation between identity and difference is the self-contradictory character of the notion of identity, because identity contains within itself the distinction between itself and difference.
Yeah, right? I agree with you completely on that point. I just wanted to clarify that self-contradiction is a helpful term to ensure your reader is not misled about that.
Yeah. So as for the absolute contradiction, I'm going to just off the seat of my pants, just on the spot, try to come up with something to say about that. I've never really thought about it. So the absolute, right, is going to mean freed from any relativity or any specificity. It's not going to be the contradiction of that and that, or the self-contradictoriness of this. What I would suggest, the absolute self-contradiction has to be something like the contradictory character of the absolute itself. Yes. The absolute, in some sense, for Hegel, is a contradiction, or a self-revolving contradiction. That, I think, just has to mean, since I think in a certain way the absolute for Hegel is thinking, that means the absolute contradiction would be thought's self-contradictory relation to itself. Not any particular contradiction in the logic, but the contradictions of the logic as a whole, not as a set or like a mereological fusion of these, but the inner principle of movement of thinking would be the absolute contradiction. That would be my guess.
Yeah. So I agree with that reading you just gave us off the cuff, But what's interesting here, in addition, is that we have this absolute contradiction of the positive, and then he talks about the absolute contradiction of the negative, right? So here what's interesting is we have this very specific application to positive and negative per se, which is interesting for us to think about as we keep reading Hegel, right? That doesn't undermine your general point that you just made.
Well, it does. It does, because I started out by assuming that the absolute contradiction.
In a certain way it does. But there's another way in which, like, the absolute properly understood is not opposed to relativity and outside of it or something, right? So in that sense, it's it coheres.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. Thanks a lot for your talk. Yeah.
Okay, so everyone who wanted to say something has said something. Greg, are there any questions on YouTube?
Let me look. Our YouTube audience has begun to decline. Oh, wait, we have a we have a comment. Let's see. Levin has a quote.
Oh, hi, Levin.
Dass bei keiner Stufe der Entwicklung eine Denkbestimmung und Reflexion vorkäme, die nicht in diese Stufe unmittelbar hervorgeht und aus den vorhergehenden in sie herübergekommen
Could you put that in the chat?
Yeah, yeah, because I don't know. Sorry.
Could you just throw that quote in the
Sorry. Let me, oh, sorry. I got confused by my, by watching YouTube and being on the, and being, I got,
oh boy.
Yeah, watching the YouTube video and the,
Right.
the Zoom. There it is. Okay. Yeah, that way you don't have to follow my.
Dass bei keiner Stufe der Entwicklung eine Denkbestimmung ist.
Yeah, it looks like he didn't add any comments. He just put that in there. We can also ask Levin if he's still watching, that maybe he can say something about what about this if he wants, if he's still with us.
Yeah, I would need to see the larger context of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If you could just give me the sentence in preferably in the Zurkamp pagination, just because that's what I have. I have okay, my Academy editions on the other side of the office.
Yeah, so now we have he responded and gave us some comments. So let me just read that. He said, wouldn't the project of making something explicit that was already implicit at the beginning of the logic conflict with Hegel's statement in the second Vorrede that we can't use any categories which haven't been derived yet? And he says this is from the third last paragraph of the second preface.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, that's great. I just think Hegel does it all the time. In other words, if we really stuck to that, the beginning of the logic would just have to be is not, is. But in fact, if we look at the logic, he uses later categories all the time. So the question is, how are those two things compatible? I think the way that they're compatible is the contradictions arise because although we're implicitly using these categories, so the contradiction arises because the only way to think any category in logic is to think its relation to all of the others. The way that the logic works is we try to think some subset of the categories with some other subset. And that always fails. The contradiction arises from that. So that the way that we resolve that contradiction is by bringing into identity the, so to speak, object language of the logic and its meta language. So at any point, there's always going to be a difference between those two. And that's why, for instance, categories of reflection like identity, like mediation, like content, like form, are presupposed throughout the logic of being. As well as, I mean, concept logical things, like mediate, syllogism, et cetera, are present throughout. So I don't think that Hegel is right about his own description of the method, that the later categories are never used, at least implicitly, earlier in the logic.
Yeah, you can't think without using concepts. As thinking begins with the logic, it's got to use concepts. I mean, you can't get away from that.
Yeah.
Okay, look, Toby, I know you have another question, but it's 9 o'clock. Perhaps I can ask you to just shoot an email to Nick with your question. Yep. Okay, so thanks everybody. We have to wind up for today. Okay. Next week, who's up next week, Greg? I should have checked this.
Maybe
you, Franca.
Yeah, maybe.
I think it is.
Thanks, everyone. I have to go prepare a class on phenomenology.
Okay, thanks, Nick, very much.
Bye.
Okay, so Franca next week. Have a good week, folks. Stay safe. See you all then.
Well, next week is good. Okay, fine, because I finished my course, and so everything could be okay. Bye.